The landscape of plantations is a unique one in the United States, embodying the structures of Southern antebellum society. I'm going to use the Southern plantation as a model for how to read a landscape, because the Southern plantation is a very clear and deliberate attempt, historically, to encode space with social, political, cultural, and economic relationships. The South was an arena of sharp social and political divisions, and conflicts that turned on an attempt to preserve what Southerners called liberty, predicated on the unfreedom of others. This world was organized by 6 levels of status. At the top were planters, immensely rich landowners with large estates, holding many souls in bondage and dominating Southern political life. Below planters were the yeomanry. These were small-scale landowners. Some were slaveholding. Others were non-slaveholding whites, or what were known as plain folk. And then below that, poor whites who held no land. Underneath that, we had free blacks who had been emancipated or born free, and there were small populations of free blacks in the South during this time, especially in South Carolina, and enslaved persons. All classes of white society were united on certain fundamentals, particularly on the preservation of slavery. And this was not because non-slaveholding whites were brainwashed, but because slavery was in their interests. And within that community of interest, slaveholders kept the ultimate upper hand, and planter values were dominant. In a sense, what plain folk had was their whiteness. Planter ideology was dominated by the ideology of paternalism. This idea grew in the early 19th century with the ending of the slave trade in 1808, which gave owners an economic interest in the survival of their property, and also as a response to growing anti-slavery critiques. Within paternalism, the master or planter was seen as father. Children, women, and slaves were weak, helpless, and dependent on that father. Within paternalism, the master was the head of a system who had the right to the obedience and labor of the enslaved, and the enslaved supposedly also had the rights of protection, counsel, guidance, subsistence, and care and attention in sickness and old age. Thus was the landscape of the slave plantation structured by the tension between the realities of chattel slavery and human life on plantations, dependent on human contact. Basic human needs had to be provided for, but social distance and hierarchy needed to be maintained. Large plantations were like mini towns, and their landscape embodied this paternalism and racial hierarchy. So we get certain images or motifs which dominate views of this landscape. The planter on his horse, and yes, that's George Washington there at Mount Vernon. White folks on the porch of the big house. Physical separation between the house and the work areas. The uniformity and bare-bones nature of slave quarters, which created a living environment for the enslaved. And, of course, a ritual landscape that foregrounded the big house as the focus of attention. Historian Del Upton has emphasized that we need to see this structured landscape as lived in practice, what he calls a processual landscape, to imagine the social experience of architecture and the landscape as a polyvocal text. In a processual landscape, we consider not only the arrangement of the buildings and the grounds, but also how people moved through space, how barriers and entrances were negotiated, looking at the front and back stages of the landscape. When we do that, we see a landscape as having multiple meanings depending on perspective. For planters, a facade of civility and regulation. For the enslaved, a fixed set of points to move around, with spaces in between for potential resistance. We know that in spaces that were dominated by enslaved persons, they did create a distinct culture, a creolization of African retentions with European forms. On some plantations, the enslaved were allowed to keep small gardens and maintain distinct food traditions. And of course, religious practices like the ring shout and spirituals found their home in such spaces. So slave quarters and other black spaces offered some degree of cultural autonomy, especially on larger plantations, or plantations where planters spent little time on site, like in the Rice Belt. We know that the enslaved did not internalize paternalism and did not identify with their masters except to negotiate or offer what is known as everyday resistance, hedging, distancing, theft, dissimulation, or running away. And the back areas in the plantation landscape provided potential cover for rebellious acts. Let's take a look at some specific plantation landscapes and how they embody these ideas. And by doing so, I want to emphasize kind of 4 major ways in which we can read a landscape. First, we look at the configuration, scope, and underlying structure of buildings and landscaping, the spatial arrangements and the ideas that they embody or represent. Many large plantations functioned as mini towns, and here we have Tuckahoe Plantation in Virginia. Tuckahoe was the Randolph family plantation and the boyhood home of Thomas Jefferson. Note the long avenue leading up to the house. This was part of the ritualistic structure of the plantation landscape that supported planter image and power. North of the main house is a row of early surviving outbuildings or what was known as the Plantation Street. Along this street, a storehouse, smokehouse, barn, kitchen, and plantation office were located. Also lined along the street were the slave quarters, 2-room, 1.5-story frame houses with central chimneys and lofts above. Pretty high end for this particular kind of structure. And this is just a photograph found on the site of a woman named Harriet, the last woman born into slavery at Tuckahoe, and her family. It was probably taken around 1915. I mentioned the ritualistic formation that embodied social and racial hierarchy, and a big part of this was the big avenue approaching the main house. Here we see it at the Rmitage Plantation in Chatham County, Georgia. The Oak Avenue, which was a long avenue leading up to the main house, and you just want to imagine that visitors to the plantation would have to come down this long avenue and then the big house would appear. And in most plantations, all the other aspects of life there, the housing, the workspaces were always behind or off to the side so that the main thing visitors would encounter was the big house. We also see at the Hermitage that we have very much a mini town, right? There's a brick kiln, a sawmill, a mill pond, a burial ground, and a hospital. And we can also notice the configuration of the so-called slave huts at the Hermitage. There's an almost industrial feel to the structures. They were meant to provide secure housing for people, but were also uniform to dehumanize those occupants. And on many plantations, the outbuildings and the slave quarters are very similar in construction and materials. The second thing we want to do when we read a landscape is look at the style and substance of the buildings or the landscape features. We might look, for instance, at the era of construction. Here we have Thornhill Plantation in Greene County, Alabama, developed as a cotton plantation by James Thornton, at one point a prominent Alabama politician. The big house at Thornhill was built by slave labor in 1833, and you'll notice that this is a later date than the 18th century Georgian houses at Tuckahoe and Greenhill, which we'll see in a moment, and reflects the style of the period. And style is another thing that we want to look at. In this case, it's a form of high architectural style with Greek revival elements. We see the colonnade along the front, the Ionic columns, and the fact that the house is painted white. All of these reflect an early Republican style, valuing democracy and reason, but also reinforcing an image of planters as powerful oligarchs. We can also identify specific vernacular styles on this landscape, such as this slave house at Thornhill Plantation. And you'll notice when you look at it, you look at the plans for this house, this is as documented by Habs, that it very much resembles a dog trot house, one of those typical Southern house types that I talked about in Place Matters, and very similar to the homes of plain white folk during this same period. Thirdly, we want to look at the plantation as processual landscape in Upton's terms, as a lived space. Here we're going to take a close look at Greenhill Plantation, which is located in Campbell County, Virginia. It's a 600-acre plantation built by Samuel Pano in 1797. Pano was a slave trader, and so you'll notice there's some elements of that on this landscape. You'll also notice that the word town is used on this map. We have both the upper town here and the lower town, as well as the long avenue leading up to the big house, which is located here. So we would start with this, obviously looking at the structure, the relationship of the different buildings, the functions of the different buildings, and how they relate to one another. But then we would also want to move through this space to understand how it was lived in, what kinds of activities took place there, and who would be engaging in those activities and when. So for instance, we might note the approach to the main house, enclosed by a stone fence and an English-style garden. There's also the side view with the side L here, which is an open workspace. And because Panel was a trader, there's also extant on this site still an auction block and auctioneer's stand, which is located off to the side of the house. And you'll see one of the agricultural buildings back here in the distance. The big house would be here, and then the auctioneer's stand and the auction block. There's also a rear L on this particular house, which was built at a later date. As we think about who is where on this site, we can imagine the view from the big house at Green Hill, what the planter would have seen as he looked out on his estate. He would have seen the various outbuildings, the fields, and he would have had a kind of position of surveying his domain up above. So this view from the big house, you can even get a feeling that it's sort of up on a slight hill. The other thing we see in this picture is the loom house on the left and the kitchen on the right, which already suggests to us that this is a large, multifunctional kind of landscape. As we reconstruct and imagine the activities that took place in these spaces, we can know who was there, what they were doing, and we begin to sort of understand the story of everyday life at this plantation. So let's take a look at some of the outbuildings. One of the most important is the kitchen, and this would have been very much a black space on the plantation. The cooking would have been done. Here's the interior view of the kitchen by enslaved African people, most likely women. And they would have had some degree of control and autonomy within this space and been responsible for cooking for the entire plantation and in some cases deciding what dishes would be done, incorporating some of that creolized understanding of foodways into what they were doing here. There are also a number of other workspaces on the plantation landscape: the barn, a laundry, a granary, and a tobacco barn. This suggests to us some of the crops that were most likely grown here: wheat and tobacco, and the fact that this was probably a largely self-sufficient functioning landscape. We can also identify these again as workspaces that would have been inhabited and utilized primarily by African Americans. Here's an example of the slave housing at Green Hill. You can see that it's compared to the ones at Thornhill, very modest, or also compared to the brick ones at Boone Hill. Very modest wooden structure. There is a chimney, but it's very small. This is the only one that survives on Green Hill, so we don't know how many there were. But again, this gives us a sense of the lived environment and the kind of spaces that enslaved people would have had not for themselves, obviously, but away from the work landscape. Modest, but also a little less controlled than some of the other places. Also, when we look at these different spaces and imagine this perceptual landscape, we want to keep in mind perspective, and this is the fourth aspect of reading a landscape. I talked about perspective as an aspect of landscape more generally. And when we get into this kind of landscape, we want to imagine that there were a variety of perspectives within this landscape. I talked about the planter surveying his domain from the big house. Here we have a view of the entire plantation compound from the fields. And we can sort of identify this as relating to the perspective of an enslaved person. And I think it's really interesting that from the perspective of the enslaved, you also see the whole plantation. You see all the buildings. You see the big house. You can see everything that's going on here. And you have an understanding of this as a whole landscape that you would move through and negotiate the spaces within. So that there's just a different perspective coming from the fields, but no less complete or holistic. Finally, just as a kind of coda, I want to add a little bit about urban slave households as a micro landscape that replicates some of the relationships of the agricultural plantation. The urban estates of planters were a micro-landscape mirroring the relationships of the plantation, enclosed by walls like a compound, to keep people in and also prying eyes out, ensuring control of the enslaved and also of the planter's paternal image. And this is a map of an urban slave household in Charleston, South Carolina, and you can see that it's a whole compound that's walled in. Here's the big house, and then there's stable, slave quarters back here in the back. We can take a look at one house in Savannah, the Owens Thomas house, which also shows this kind of plan. Here's the view from the front of the house, one that visitors would have come up through, and you see the kind of ritualistic organization of space, the front gate, the curved staircases going up on both sides of the front door. Here's a view of the rear of the house, also very formalized. And if we take a look at what's back behind the house, we see that there's actually a rear courtyard and a very formal English garden, as well as farther back, another gateway and a more utilitarian outbuilding. This is the location of the slave quarters and the carriage house. So the carriage house and the stables would have been down below. And then the slave quarters were up here on the second floor. It's interesting, if you think about this as a processual landscape, that we could imagine coming in through the front of the house, coming in through the back of the house. And actually today, if you take a tour of the Owens Thomas house, you get a sense of this because they actually start the tour down here in the stables and the slave quarters. You go upstairs in the slave quarters and then you walk back out. You walk up back through the rear courtyard into the basement of the great house, which is the kitchen, and then eventually move your way up into the top floors of the big house where people would have lived and socialized, white folks. And it's interesting because this tour kind of flips the dominant script of this landscape on its head. Instead of starting with the planter's power and looking at how they've organized this space, we start in the slave quarters and understand how this space would have been negotiated from a different perspective. And this is a view of the slave quarters interior with the haint blue painted ceiling. This is considered an African retention and something that's very distinctive to spaces that were in any way shaped by African Americans. So just to summarize how to read a landscape, there are 4 basic steps that you can take to understand what is going on in any given landscape and what sorts of stories can be told from that landscape. You want to map the underlying structure, the spatial arrangements between different landscape features or buildings, understand what sorts of social relationships that structure represents, or cultural understandings. Describe the style and substance of specific landscape features, whether this is buildings or other kinds of human-created elements. What do they look like? When were they built? What's the style? What are the values associated with that style? 3, imagine or reconstruct that landscape as lived in practice. Who's going where? What are they doing? Who are they interacting with? How can we reconstruct this from other sorts of primary sources? And sometimes we just kind of have to use a little imagination too. And finally, consider the issue of perspective in the landscape and assume that there is multivocality. Assume that there are multiple perspectives within this landscape, and then see how they map to all of the above 3 things. What would be the relationship of a person who had a particular perspective to this larger structure? How might they have negotiated it? What would it have felt and looked like for them? And then there's where we can locate maybe some pushback against that underlying structure, maybe ways in which people attempted to renegotiate or mediate that structure in some way, as when we talked about everyday resistance on the part of the enslaved. So that, in short, is one way of how to read a landscape.